Let me first of all start by welcoming you all to this session and to thank you for coming and to participating in the discussion. One thing I would like to begin by saying is that we're going to have a few minutes on what's called the issues paper, and then everyone will introduce their policy brief. Franco, Dennis, and I would very much like to emphasize that the issues paper is not intended in any way to be a summary of all the great ideas we have had, but it's in itself just another contribution. And so we want to emphasize that everyone's contribution is important to the discussion today and important to us in the way in which we will all take these ideas forward, both collectively and of course in our own individual spaces and places. So let me kick off right away and say that in the issues paper, we have been thinking about a number of challenges or problems. The first, I think, is that we have been thinking about the new challenges that we face post-pandemic, and with the invasion of Ukraine close upon us in Europe, and how we can best protect our citizens and communities from the kind of challenges that they will face, not just today, but in the future. So it's not just how do we deal with what is here now, but what will come next. And the social protection that we have thought about in the past has been very much a matter for individual nations. Now it has become one of the major challenges globally for all nations of the world. How can we, all of us together, protect our citizens through the next set of transformations that are coming in the economy, but also the transformations that will come as a result of tackling the climate crisis and the conjoined biodiversity crisis. So we've put in the issues paper some emphasis on this question of what universal social protection should look like. And we've been talking about the emergence of a new basket of public goods that will become important in order to support the development of capacities and capabilities for citizens in the future, as well as protecting them now, which we have been calling universal basic services. And those include not just the standard ones of health and education, but transport, digital access, food, and so on. Now, one of the big challenges of the moment, of course, is how can we pay for this new basket of public goods, which is necessary to protect our citizens across the world. And there've been quite, in the task force discussions, there've been some very, very good contributions on how we can design and think about and pay for this new set of public goods. Clearly, tax reform will be necessary, but so will different ways of thinking about cost versus investment. It should be clear, I think, to all of us that many of the challenges we face, it would be cheaper to invest now rather than to mitigate later. And that important point is something that needs to come into national budgeting. And it needs to be connected to the ways in which we want to reinforce reciprocity and connect contributions that all of us make to access to social protections. And we've, as I said, had some excellent ideas in the task force, which will be explained in the policy briefs later. A further point I want to make is that we are living in a situation as we try to take account of the fact that the ecology crisis we face is actually an equality crisis. So inequality is an inextricable part of the environmental and ecological crisis that we face. That we inhabit, of course, all of us as we sit on the planet, these non-linear, very dynamic systems. And they provide diversity of challenge. And so we have to understand two things. One, how to deal with the great drivers of the day. So those are such things as biodiversity, climate change, migration, and so on, which are affecting all of us, but also what happens at the local level. And here we have a problem because most of our national policies are focused on, or built rather, on an economic framework that emphasizes the micro and the macro, and actually leaves out this middle part, which we can call the meso. And so we've been thinking about how can we work with local communities, with regions, to develop metrics that make sense at the local level and take account of the specific impacts that the big drivers, de-industrialization, the collapse of decent work, climate change, biodiversity challenge, and so on, are actually happening at the local level. How do we empower and give agency to citizens and bring them closer to policymaking? And a number of contributors to this task force have come up with some really excellent ideas there. Now, in my own work and that of my team, we've been working at this local meso level, trying to get a clearer understanding of the interconnecting and intersecting factors that make up prosperity and how those forms of prosperity are actually transboundary. In other words, the challenges we face in one area intersect with challenges we face in another. So, for example, if we have poor quality water, then clearly we have poor quality health. And we have to drive many changes together. And that means that we need to bring in a kind of multi-stakeholder approach, which is focused on social cohesion. And here, I think we bring forward some new ideas on digital governance and on the way in which data and the digital will be driving new forms of innovation, productivity, and behavior change into the future, but also how we need to use the digital framework to bring to the fore the fact that social solidarity and the creation of social value in our communities going forward is what will drive further economic value. So one of the big challenges here is what do we do about digital governance and digital citizenship? And digital citizenship then comes to the fore as one of this basket of new public goods. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Dennis Snower, who's going to talk a little bit more about various aspects, including the digital, I understand. So Dennis, please.
Good, thank you so much. I'll be very brief. With regard to our particular contribution to the issue brief on digital governance, it's very useful to know that the digital consumers currently being used by the digital providers, by third-party funders, the influencers, from economic influencers, advertising, political influencers. And this is a $515 billion market that is between those who collect and aggregate that information and those who purchase that information, which consumers are unaware of and are certainly not in on. And it's very useful, therefore, to give digital consumers, digital citizens, control over the data about themselves. One of the proposals that we make is that all data that requires official authentication actually have to receive this official authentication in order to be used. And this official data should be in the hands of the digital consumer. And all data that is inferred about people, that should be governed in the same way as doctor-patient relationships are governed in the offline world, so only in the interests of the digital consumer. And lastly, information that is collective, it be put into data commons, and these data commons are specified. The data can only be used for the purpose in which that has been established for that data commons, and the people who organize it have a fiduciary responsibility to adhere to those rules. And through such means, it would be possible to give digital to confer digital citizenship, because this is the first time in the history of humanity where people do not have control over the social networks that they use. and they're given very extreme, artificially restricted choices between revealing huge amounts of personal data about themselves or being excluded from the economic and social interactions that define their identities and livelihoods. That is unreasonable and needs to be stopped. And the issue paper sheds some light on it. That's, I think, as far as I would like to take it. Then I think the time is to proceed to all the rest of the policy briefs. Sarah John has helpfully divided them into 4 categories. There are policy briefs on prosperity measurement, some on just transition, another on universal protection, and last one on digital governance, aside from what is in the issue paper. And my suggestion is that we just group them that way and start with prosperity measurement. And the first policy brief, you each have 2 minutes for you. And I know this is very short, but it'll enable us to have a 5-minute discussion at the very end, which is really the least we can do. And then we will extend this discussion in workshops later on. So in prosperity measurement, we've got a policy brief by Jacob, Katharina, and Richard. Jacob Dirksen, Katharina de Miranda, and Richard Weik. I don't know who will be presenting that, but I would love to give you the 2-minute floor.
Yeah, I'll start on behalf of my courses as well. I hope you can all hear me okay online as well, and everyone here in the room. It's
Oh, we're now having serious difficulties hearing you. You are breaking up in a way that it does not enable me to follow your exposition. Do you have a co-author who is able to give it another shot? Well, what I would suggest in the meantime, since time is so short, could we go on to Rohan Lorgat, who has a policy brief on this, and then come back to you once you've wrestled a little more with the digital connection. Is that okay?
That's okay.
Wonderful. Rohan.
Yeah, thanks, Des. So our policy brief on the Prosperity Index. The IGP has been pioneering citizen-led prosperity indices across the globe, including in the UK in the context of urban regeneration, and Lebanon in the context of mass displacement and refugee crises, and in Tanzania. We fundamentally believe that having richer and deeper understandings of the factors that drive people's prosperity is important for to understand the drivers of inter- and inter-regional inequalities and addressing the 21st century challenges. Citizen-led prosperity indices enable policymakers to reduce the demographic deficit in policymaking and decision-making processes, as well as increasing social participation, which aligns with the open and inclusive democratic societies that the G7 values highly. This is much more than a beyond GDP measure, as it creates the pathways and frameworks that brings together citizens, communities, policymakers, and civil society to operationalize sustainable prosperity for different locales. We propose that G7 countries should focus on implementing citizen-led prosperity indices as a new way to govern places and map out pathways and policies that reflect the lived experiences of people in the 21st century. And along with this, we want G7 economies to switch their macroeconomic policies to the new meso level, thus providing a more deeper and clearer understanding of the factors that cause persistent widening of intra- and inter-regional inequalities.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Very exciting. Could we give the first policy brief another try, one by Jacob, Katarina, and Richard?
Yes, I'll try again. Thanks to the IT support here. I hope you can all hear me fine now.
Very good.
Excellent, thanks, Dennis. So the challenge that we, Richard, Katarina, and I in our policy brief are addressing is exactly the one of moving beyond GDP as the goalpost indicator for prosperity measurement and also as a yardstick for policies. As an indicator that looks at productivity growth and material gain and really treating as derivative only the things that we do value, including social solidarity and participation, personal agency, opportunities, and of course, environmental sustainability. So it very much continues from the conversations we've had this morning on recoupling, on moving beyond GDP as an indicator that can guide policies and help us to monitor and track progress. And in order to help the global community through the G7 to tackle this and to make progress on measuring progress in the way that we all conceptualize it, and then to make policies towards it, we recommend to the G7 under the German presidency the following concrete steps. First of all, to establish a dedicated working group that can explore measurement of prosperity in all its forms and dimensions, including, of course, the economy, but also social and environmental aspects, and to align the G7 members around concrete and measurable policy goals for prosperity in all its forms and dimensions. On the other hand, what we also do recommend is to reinforce and innovate on data collection. We've heard a lot in the previous panel, if you've attended that one, on data collection and monitoring efforts. And we do feel a need to reinforce those, especially coming out of a pandemic that has interrupted the collection of household survey data, for example. And also very importantly, to make sure that opinion surveys are conducted that can ensure that what we measure and the prosperity that we then strive towards, guided by these measures, is grounded in people's values and lived experiences. And the last point that we recommend is that the G7 do not try to reinvent the wheel. There's many existing initiatives on measurement, and we've heard on many of them this morning already. So we do also recommend explicitly to leverage synergies between measurement approaches that have been proposed by various United Nations agencies, the OECD, the European Union, and also by the participants of the multidimensional poverty peer network. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think this is an ongoing theme and will need to be pursued at both the G7 and the G20 level. Thank you. We move on to just transition. And here we've got a policy brief by Burko Ecke-Schneider.
Yes. Hi.
Very good.
I'm here. Should I start?
Please, you've got your 2-minute slot.
Thank you so much. As a peace worker, I would like to share today about the sowing seeds for peace, micro-level peace building methods towards a just and sustainable urban transformation process policy recommendation. Social justice is a prerequisite for any move towards a sustainable future. Environmental degradation impacts the poorer, more vulnerable communities, fueling larger systematic crises. There can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. The transformative power of cities is key, but this can't be executed without recognizing that cities are shared spaces with people from a variety of cultures. Nature can be used as a new element to help along this pathway, like war trauma healing process or all the other traumas healing process we can use in nature as an element. It's important to reach the veins of society during the new peace architecture process. So I request to make it a legal requirement for developers and public bodies in any new local level urban development law to provide access to nature-rich spaces for everyone. I also request to put peace education programs like focusing on inclusivity, diversity, equity, sustainability, and well-being of our social and ecological environments at the center of our educational and professional paths. Finally, I request the importance of providing more visibility for marginalized people in local media and the political realm, especially for women, in order to encourage them to construct a healing and respected identity. Women's inclusion in peace-building processes is essential for a long-term success. New micro-changes period like building peace among neighbors and within neighborhoods and cities are the future. Our strong and healthy communities will be able to contribute to the future of our cities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. I think it is striking the degree to which we focus on well-being rather than the traditional metrics, and that will definitely need to come into our recommendations. The next is Paul Granger, under Just Transition. Paul, are you there? No, I have not heard. Well, we'll come back. There's another policy brief by Maurizio Böhl, Andrew Shepard, Alexia Faust, Olbari, and Vidya Divakar. Who will present that policy brief? No, there seem to be no takers there as well. We'll return to them later on. So we now move on to the title of Universal Protection. And there we have a policy brief by Hayo Lantz. I see you, Hayo.
Yes, and I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you. Great to be here. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, more than half of the global population were without any form of social protection whatsoever. That means there was no income security for children, for persons with disabilities, unemployed people, pregnant person, women, elders, and without any access to basic health services. And the current global health crisis is, so we believe, an opportune moment for the global community to address major systemic social imbalances in the world. We therefore suggest a pragmatic and affordable global strategy to support the attainment of social protection for all and full employment as a central means to combat poverty, inequality, insecurity, and ill health. This strategy consists of two elements. One, strengthening the implementation of existing employment and social protection standards, and notably establishing a new international standard of universal social protection floors to extend the policy space for social protection on the national level. Second, targeted financial support through a financing facility for a small group of countries which cannot afford to finance their basic social protection systems alone. International solidarity is not a substitute for domestic reforms or for increased mobilization of domestic resources. We see it as a precondition for both. Numerous studies confirm that there are presently only about a dozen low-income countries which would have to spend more than 10% of their GDP to close their social protection floor gap. If the international community were to help on a transitional basis to close the gap in these countries by covering 50% of the costs, then the estimated global annual cost would be in the order of $15 billion. Supporting only the poorest 5 would amount to less than $3 billion. Just recently, a major and crisis-triggered initiative has been added to the global policy discourse by the UN Secretary General. His global accelerator for jobs and social protection provides the perfect landing zone and institutional platform for the strategy we are presenting today. We therefore urge the G7 to make sure the accelerator includes international financing mechanisms that pool the international financial resources made available for the extension of social protection systems and the achievement of higher levels of decent employment, and to mobilize sufficient momentum to establish a new UN Convention on Universal Social Protection Floors. Thank you. Dennis, back to you.
Thank you very much. Very concise and terribly important. Now we've got one by Marieke Blofield plus co-authors. Are you here, Marieke?
I'm here, yes.
Please.
Okay, thank you. And it feeds very nicely into what Hayo did. Ours is a little bit more specific. We call for a global universal basic income for children at the World Bank extreme poverty level of $1.9 per day per child across the world. And it feeds directly into the G7 priority of tackling issues of global urgency and providing people with tangible improvements. We do this because poverty is especially globally concentrated in children. 1 of every 2 people in poverty around the world is under 18 years old. Also, the huge negative effect from deprivation, especially extreme poverty among children, is huge, not just for humanitarian and child well-being reasons, but it is a huge lost opportunity in terms of basic investment in human capital. This, we know from lots of empirical evidence, can be alleviated very efficiently and effectively with cash transfers. And cash transfers, well, I mean, they're not totally cheap, but they're also not insurmountably expensive. In our policy brief, we calculate what it would take, which is basically if everybody got it and we look at the different demographic, basically it would be 1.6% of global GDP, GNI. We suggest some ways to tax that globally based on Gianluca Grimalda's policy brief from last year on that issue. And we think that to do so would have, I mean, you'd have these costs, but it would be hugely positive effects. We suggest a global fund, a national distribution. The last 2 years of pandemic have really extended the ability of governments to reach households with cash transfers. We suggest building on that know-how that exists. And it feeds directly into 3 G7 priorities. Economic stability would provide a buffer to vulnerable households, allow people to invest in their kids, and also indirectly job creation through its effects on demand. Also G7 priority 3, for healthy population, direct effect on nutrition of children, also significant effect on mental health of caregivers and the whole family, and a reduction of violence towards children in the household as a result. Finally, G7 priority number 5, which is cohesion, stronger together, gender equity. We recommend distributing these cash transfers preferentially via mothers because of the effects that has on economic empowerment of women and reduction of intimate partner violence, and those have been empirically demonstrated. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Very exciting indeed. Next, we have Rohan again, who is a multiple contributor in this group.
Yes, thanks.
You want to go ahead?
Yes, sure. So our policy brief on universal protections focuses on collective services and social infrastructure. With the current energy crisis, cost of living crisis, and climate emergency, this means we will all require more broader social protections. We need to move away from a defensive idea of welfare to more proactive creation of conditions that support the social, economic, and environmental transitions needed in the 21st century. A more comprehensive and more universal system of social protections requires moving away from the previous models of compensatory redistribution and recognizes the interdependence and intersecting nature of social protections. Thus, our proposal for UBS includes 7 basic services: shelter, food, education, health and care, transport, digital and data, and civil legal protections. Our proposal for universal protections is based on those 7 key services and is underpinned by universal access, which means there's very little conditionality involved in this proposal. And it recognizes that the importance to support collective and universal behavior change, for example, shifting towards public transport and away from non-electric private vehicle ownership with the addition of free transport. Therefore, we would call local authorities or the equivalent across the G7 to implement UBS pilots to test and explore what exactly a 21st century state focus on the provision of universally accessible and collectively provided services will look like. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much. These are, they're painting part of all a larger picture. So this is really, really exciting. Gianluca, are you around? Gianluca had presented, but he wasn't confirmed. Let's go back to the Just Transition group. Is Paul Granger, have you joined us now? Or what about Maurizio Böhl, Andrew Shepard, Alexia, and Vidya?
Yes.
Any of you here?
Yes, I'm here. Hi,
Very
guys.
good. Please, off you go, and you've got 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate coming after Rohan because our proposal is very connected to this. I have been working with my group on integrated social protection plus. We see that right now with the COVID-19 pandemic that has created a lot of socioeconomic effects that we will only see in the long term. For example, school dropouts or other vulnerabilities that are created for women and children are going to increase the pressure not only on the poorest, but also on the missing middle that we have been seeing in our studies on COVID-19, that there has been a lot of pressure on informal workers. Additionally, or at the same time, we have new compounding crises like the Ukraine war, but obviously also climate change. And the socially just transition that the G7 are aiming for will need a comprehensive approach in order to work, which focuses on the green recovery, but at the same time also provides everybody the opportunity to participate in this new structural change that we want to create. So my group and I, we are proposing that integrated social protection plus would be an opportunity for this. On the one hand, integrated social protection creates an environment where benefits and services complement each other to adequately support human development. And on the other hand, we see a strong need for plus there, which would be promote sustained poverty escapes by growth from below. Growth from below means small scale informal investments that provide all vulnerable to participate in a socially just transition. We believe that it's important, as we have heard from the group before, to take a universal approach, because we have seen during the pandemic that it's very, very challenging to target certain groups. Inequality is something, or vulnerability is something that is not easily identified, and universal access to such integrated programs will be crucial in order to make sure that we have a socially just transition that like it's promoted by the G7. And therefore we need to look at the 3 Ps, which are protection, prevention, and promotion, and take there a poverty dynamic lens that looks at looks at how people are falling into poverty, how vulnerabilities are increased over time, and ensures that we have a strong systemic approach towards our needed structural change for a socially just transition. Therefore, to end my quick presentation, the G7 should on the one hand promote integrated approaches within sustainable development councils on the national level. It's important that we identify context-specific combinations for integrated social protection plus, because every country needs a different path, and the G7 has the opportunity to promote such long-term investments into social protection. And on the other hand, obviously, funding is going to be a big challenge for developing countries. And there we see the Global Social Protection Fund, as already presented by other groups in this meeting, as a great opportunity for all countries to achieve integrated social protection plus, which then will also lead to a decrease in inequality, hopefully, and also establish or foster more social cohesion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. It's interesting, these common themes of universality, the anti-trickle-down movement that is developing here, all very noteworthy. I think we now come to the section on digital governance. There is a policy brief by Melin Li, Declan, Peter, Kurt, Tamara, Andrew, and Gora. Are either any of you here? See Melin, is that right?
So there's a participant with us in the room, but she's
That's right, she is.
Yes. Okay. Melin, I'm finally here.
Melin.
Thank you. Yes, there's a huge amount of data that's available for science that could be made available, but is currently not available because the people who do the science somewhat own the data, whereas many, many stakeholders are involved in scientific research. So we are proposing that shifting our intellectual property frameworks for a digital realm could take us to a fairer, more reliable, and more fact-driven landscape than the pen and paper institutions of the past. And the provenance of the data is the most critical in security, its integrity. However, what we need is a form of digital common law that could emerge from the use cases for scientific research, digital utilities. The idea of a digital utility would allow the sharing of the data, which maximizes its common good, not just for the current generation, but future generation. New discoveries could be made. In the short term, we propose the G7 needs to create policies that work across national boundaries at all stages of the innovation cycle, from basic science to applied research and the application in commercial entities. We need global pathways for global policies. And we're hamstrung by research financing policy, which lack policies for funding global intellectual property infrastructure. In the midterm, we propose the G7 call for a UN Science Digital Commons, akin to the UN Law of the Sea Conference, recognizing science like the sea as a shared global resource. In the long term, we urge reform of the global patent system, which really limits defined processes that allow less developed countries to access what should be a global good. The G7 should call for an updated fair sharing model for patent access and distribution. While the laws exist today, in practice, then the access of less developed countries, it's much less. And finally, the G7 should examine what negatively impacts scientific access to data and build capacity to overcome the barriers. The final example is the EU Biobank cannot continue in using old examples of how data is protected, when in fact we need to have new models for how scientific research can benefit all of humanity, no matter where they live. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. This is extremely interesting, and one thought that keeps on recurring is that if there is any movement in the G20, this will not occur within 1 year or 2 years, or even 3. I would very much recommend that all of you send Global Solutions your policy briefs, where we can put them onto our G20, G7 Insights platform, and they can be revived from year to year and updated so that a succession of G7 and G20 communities can be working on them. This is wonderful. Thank you. We've got one more contribution by Rohan. Are you still available, or are you just exhausted by now?
Sorry, Mr. Snower.
Yes.
Mr. Villafranca is in the auditorium, and I think he would like to address the panel as well.
I would be delighted, Antonio, if you would. I'm so sorry that I have overlooked you.
No problem at all. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right. Now, let me just give context to all the very interesting ideas which have been presented so far. Absolutely excellent, but we have to also consider what is, the international system in which, this proposal should be implemented. And the international system today is marked by another, black swan after the other one, after the COVID-19, which is the Ukrainian war. And the world we are moving to is a world in which there will be a sort of bipolar system, which will be totally different from the ones we knew in this during the Cold War. So it has profound implications in terms, for instance, of digitalization, all the proposal you have been proposing so far. But we have to acknowledge that in the digital sphere, there is a growing segmentation of the internet access, of the data storage. So, this is, the suggestion, the comment which comes from me. Let's try to, also fine tune and reconsider to some extent these proposals also in the new international scenario which is emerging. And which is marked by these new policies at the state level, at the regional level, which are at odds with some of these proposals in terms of SDGs. How we can change? Probably we have to change the very SDGs because the Ukrainian war is working as a sort of accelerator of the previous accelerator, which was the COVID-19. It's changing everything in terms of inequalities, in terms of poverty. There will be 250 million people which are pushed under the threshold of poverty worldwide over the last 2 years. In terms of starvation, there will be 500 million people which will be starving this year, let alone malnutrition. And the Ukrainian war is going to have a profound impact on food availability, especially in some regions, starting from the Mediterranean. So my only advice, if I may, is let's consider the international system, the implications of the war in the achievement of all these goals. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Antonio, I'm really, really grateful for this, and we should take this up in the final discussion. But in response to this, there have been suggestions like a coalition of the willing, like the climate club that Olaf Scholz has suggested, where you do not have the ambition that everyone in the world does it, but that developed and developing countries could come into some coalition with a certain ground rule, that hopefully, if successful, would attract more participants later on. But let us by all means discuss this, but I'm eager to hear Rehan's last contribution of the many that he has made in this task force.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dennis. So our next policy brief is titled Data Citizenship, and we also bring digital into this conversation, and we propose that digital and data should be added to a basket of essential social goods to further strengthen social cohesion and solidarity. So digital and data citizenship frames digital access and data control as part of the same basket of public goods, such as health and education. So we propose that G7 countries will formally commit to putting the citizens' interests at the centers of policies that govern digital and data by establishing data citizenship as an integral part of the protections and the public goods that are delivered and provided by governments. Digital and data access is crucially essential for individuals to flourish and is important for the overall health and functioning of societies and democracy, especially with data, AI, and digital infrastructures becoming increasingly abundant in the running of our societies and economies. So our final call to the G7 would also be to provide citizens with also verifiable forms of identity, such as like digital passports. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much indeed. This leaves us with exactly 5 minutes for discussion, which is exactly what we had intended. If we could return to Antonio's discussion, and I would like to turn this over to you, Henrietta, to manage this exceedingly unruly crowd and get some overview of where we are. Is that okay with you? You're still muted.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sorry, absolutely, Dennis, sorry. Struggling with the technology. So let's go into the discussion, shall we, right away, and see where we can pick up on some of the synergies which are very evident, I think, in what we've been talking about today. So, who would like to come in briefly, quickly? I can't see any hands.
We have here, for example, Peter Eigen is on this, and I'm sure Peter, you'd have something interesting to contribute on transparency in this issue. And Antonio's issue would be terribly important.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis, for singling me out. But I'm embarrassed to say that I was interrupted a couple of times while we had this very interesting discussion. I believe very strongly, of course, in the capacity of data to change governance, to change the world. I like to see this in a dual way. I see the cognitive part of it, where we have to find the best and the most professional way of producing and circulating data. But it's also the normative way, which is basically the capacity to use data in a way where we try to make recommendations and where we pass value judgments. So it is this latter part which I find so important, and I was very happy to hear that some of you proposed multi-stakeholder approaches, because this is a way in which we can create a modicum of input legitimacy of the judgments which we need to make when we want to get involved in advocacy with our work. So thank you very much for this tremendous discussion, but I apologize for only having captured part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And have we got other questions coming in? We should pick up again on Antonio's point about the changing nature of the world, because of course that's the massive context in which all these proposals will have to find purchase and impact. Do we have any members of the panel, the task force, sorry, who would like to quickly come in there? You'll have to jump in because we're a many number and I can't see hands. I think Antonio, just coming back to your point from my side, I think what's important here, and linking to what Peter has just said, is this balance between addressing what is happening now and addressing what will come next, and trying to understand how those things work. And I think building the capacities and capabilities of citizens, which is partly what Peter has just suggested, is a hugely important part of that. Exactly how we do it, I think there's no simple answer here, but going to the digital point and the data point, if we think about addressing the challenges of migration, conflict, and climate and biodiversity as forms of investment rather than as costs, we can think, I think, about fiscal constraint in a different way. And I think that would be very important, because if we were to get the digital data stuff right, we would get an uptick in productivity, and even a very, very, very modest uptick in productivity would counteract the costs of those investments up front. So there's a very important set way in which the economics, the social solidarity issues you raise, and the new world order has to speak to the different kinds of economics that are coming into play. So Dennis, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there.
If I could just add one thought, which is, as Antonio, you've said, there is a disconnect between the idealism that is reflected in most of the policy briefs and the harsh realities of geopolitics currently. And my question to all of you is this driving us more towards using the flexible geometry of the G7 to create constellations of countries within the G7 and beyond, across the developing divide, within certain areas of social protection, so that we are able to start something off. In the digital world, of course, one would imagine that if a constellation of countries got together that gave true digital citizenship to its citizens, that would attract a huge amount of economic activity, analogous to the activity that was attracted to countries that started the Industrial Revolution. And so that would set in motion, hopefully, a virtuous dynamic. I see Arvin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for a very fascinating and informative discussion. My name is Arvin Gadel. I am director of the UNDP Oslo Governance Center. We try to advise our governance operations in more than 130 countries around the world, and also the UN leadership on governance challenges. But in addition to that, we have a particular responsibility in terms of measuring SDG 16. And in that context, listening to Peter and listening to many of you, I just feel the need to make the following point. We talk about data as it is a colorless mass with where data in and of itself is always positive. That is in most cases true, but it's also true that where most of the investment in data at the moment is going is not into the systems of the nation states. It's into third-party data measurement and in data sets that are ultimately not owned by member states of the United Nations themselves. This is a fundamental challenge, and the need for invest in national statistics offices, their legal licenses to operate, their freedom and independence is something that I'd really like all of us to start focusing more on, because without it, I think we will be coming short of our targets. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Arvin, for that excellent point, which I think resonates much with Dennis. Dennis, you're on mute, so I jumped in.
All I was going to say is we've hit our time constraints and we will have to sign off at this point, but this was extremely stimulating. And together with Henrietta, I'd like to thank you all and look forward to more.